You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I start the podcast, I just want to pay my respects and acknowledge the original custodians of the country that I'm working from, which is the Gadigal people from the Eora Nation. And I want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the future, and that we have an appropriate coexistence with one another. So, this is Season 5, folks. And my understanding is that there will also be a Season 6. But let me stay focused with Season 5, Episode 1. And I want to do a little bit of a special today because I've invited someone special to me to share the podcast with me. But before I do that, I just want to extend my gratitude and thanks to our listeners out there and in the respective nations. And when I got breakdown for where our listeners are, I was a little bit blown out. So I'll run through that. So obviously Australia, the United States, and this one for me was a little bit out of the box, Barbados. And then the country where I was born, Austria, has kicked in as well. And Finland, of all places. The United Kingdom, Italy, again, something that really surprised me was Nigeria, and even more of a surprise, Nepal. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I sincerely hope that no matter where on the planet you are, that this is contributing to you and the way that you think about, the sort of issues that we as human beings, as men especially, but as human beings are facing in the 21st century, and how to live a richer, more fulfilling, more engaged life. And a few years ago when I set up Making Good Men Great, my fundamental aim at that stage was to create a program that addressed the issue of men understanding patriarchy and how destructive that is to our emotional and social life. And it's a topic that I still find is not really addressed in depth. We talk a lot about men needing to be more emotional and more switched on in relationships, but we're not really covering the basis outside of academia where we're talking about why is it that we've gotten where we are, which is about how we're socialized into an ideology that's really toxic. The traditional masculine stereotype is a bit like watching John Wayne in a Western. At least that dates me. What might be the more appropriate one for the current generations? Well, take a pick. Is it Andrew Tate? Is it, incels? They're not well-rounded human beings, and in many respects, for themselves and others, they're actually often really dangerous because they promote a way of thinking, a way of relating to people that is, horrendous. I don't want to drag on too much about Andrew Tate, but luckily the man's in custody, and I'm hoping that goes further, because there needs to be some reckoning, some accountability about what it is that you can in this essentially, competitive, combative attitude towards others, dog eat dog. That is not how human beings are. And I'm going to engage Mark in a minute about more of that. So Making Good Men Great really was about bringing that into our conversation as men. But the other part of it is that if most of us as men, I see as good men, we want to try and do the right thing, but we're sort of a little bit lost in what that exactly translates into and where we're going with this. And if I take it then, well, how do we become great? Well, it's about embracing the inclusivity that's right in front of our face that we traditionally have ignored, where this is about men and this is about women. if we really take a strong, hard look at where we need to go, we need to go away from the binary idea that this is what men do or what men feel or how men are programmed, and this is what women do and how they're programmed, and with a bit of luck we somehow might meet on some points. The point that I want to make is that as long as we try to idolise a particular idea of either femininity or masculinity, we're behind the eight ball. We're already on a slippery slope into potentially what can break out into violence. And I want you to think about that, because I think that whole idea is really, really important, because fundamentally we need to get to a place where we relate to each other as human beings. And that's the important aspect. So, let me introduce Dr. Mark Williams. Now, I've pinched his intro bio from his webpage. Very lazy. So, who is he? Well, he's an internationally recognised professor of cognitive science with over 25 years' experience conducting behavioural and brain imaging research focusing on our social skills. He's taught the fundamentals of neuroscience to a wide range of undergraduates and postgraduate students, as well as publishing more than 70 scientific articles. Mark's been awarded numerous high-profile fellowships and grants and worked both at MIT in the United States and at universities in Australia. So in a nutshell, Mark is the academic that I'm not. I'm the clinician. Right. I have no scientific articles published. and there is, sometimes it's a bit of a sort of bone of contention in my self-evaluation, but I try to get past it. You never know. There could be some in the future. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you on. So, you want to fill in a little bit on that bio, because everyone says you're not the usual professor. And I must say that when I met you, I had to attest to thinking the same thing. Right? And I try not to prejudge.
Yeah, I think the tattoos give me away in that respect. It's usually the big giveaway. I grew up in a small country town in Victoria in Australia, and there was high unemployment at the time. There was a lot of drugs and there was a lot of alcohol in the town, and it was a pretty violent town, as a lot were in the 70s and 80s. It was the end of the white Australia policy, but the ramifications of that were still there. So Colac was very white, very, very white. And my mother had mental illness problems. My father did too, but we didn't realise that until much later in life. But she had major mental illness issues and would self-medicate with drugs, whatever she could get a hold of. And so my childhood was pretty... I'm not sure how to explain it, but it wasn't fun, I don't think, now looking back on it. But it was my life, so at the time I didn't realise that there was real big issues. But basically I stopped going to school regularly in about grade 5, grade 6, and didn't really engage in school from then on. There was still corporal punishment at schools in those days, so me and my mates used to try to avoid corporal punishment. We didn't want to get the strap or the cane, so we'd usually go fishing, or we'd go and do other things to sort of avoid those that situation, which was a good way to avoid it. And I had a lot of fun, and I made a lot of good mates. But I also got myself into a lot of trouble. When I was in year 9 or form 3 back then, we used to call it, my principal told me and my parents that I would be dead or in prison by the time I was 25, which was something that really stuck with me and affected the way I saw myself and who I was as a person. And so his suggestion was that I should leave school and get an apprenticeship at the local abattoir or slaughterhouse, depending on where you live. So I stayed at school for a little bit longer, and then I sort of muddled around. I moved to Melbourne, and then I started travelling, which I think was the best thing I could have done. It was... I had this real desire to see the world, and I had a very negative opinion of myself, but I had a very positive opinion of people because of that mateship I had when I was younger, and that relationships that I built up through that. So I travelled a lot. I used to work night shift at service stations, petrol stations, which would earn me good money, and then I'd go travelling mainly through Southeast Asia, which was a great experience, and I must admit I enjoyed that period. But I was also still into drugs, and I was taking a lot of different drugs. And when I was 25, ironically, two of my good friends both had drug overdoses, and that made me rethink where I was in life. There was other things that had happened which had shaken me as well, but that really made me go, hang on, I've got to do something different. So I decided to go back to school and get my HSC, or Year 12, so that I could get a good job, was basically my idea and why I did it. But there was a physics teacher when I was doing that course who saw something in me that I'd never seen before, and he sort of... he convinced me that I was actually intelligent. He convinced me that I actually had something to offer, which I hadn't seen before, and that was a beautiful thing. And so he said I should go to university, so I did enrol in university. I ended up, as you said, I ended up doing Bachelor of Science and did psychology and physiology as majors, which was unusual in those days. So I ended up being a cognitive neuroscientist as a result of all of that, which was amazing. And I ended up working at MIT, which was an incredible place to work. But it was because of that physics teacher which changed my life, which means that I am extremely passionate about education and the impact that we can have on each other. And that, I think, is really, really important. So since I've come back to Australia 15 years ago, I spent a lot of time working in schools, and I continue to work in schools with teachers and teaching teachers, but also talking about with both students and teachers about the impact that we're all having on each other and the impact that we can have on each other. And I think that's a really important thing to recognise, that we are such an influence on each other, and we need to realise that, and we need to appreciate that more than we actually do, and that we are determined by our interactions, not by anything physical, but actually by the interactions that we have.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I reflect on my own experience at school, and I would get really good grades with teachers that I had a relationship with, and I would have just crap results with teachers who either didn't know my name or they knew my name but in a really negative context because I'd muck up. And like you, I managed to work out how not to get the cane. But it was a dodging exercise, and so certain subjects I very rarely fronted up for, whereas in others you couldn't have, held me away. I'd be there with bells on, waiting for the teacher to come in. And so I took that away with me because I remember starting to do some counselling, especially with teenagers and especially around drug use. And everyone was talking about which types of therapies. And, I was very keen to sort of learn as many therapies as possible. And then one day I had a mentor who said, forget the therapies. What are you bringing to the table as a person? And I went, that's absolutely right. So it doesn't matter whether you're a parent, a teacher, or a therapist, a counsellor. It's what you bring that creates some, relationship with the person that they can relate to you as and from. Yeah. Interesting hearing about your parents, because like my parents too had mental health issues. Both my parents were, my dad had a shockingly abusive father, and my mother is essentially a war survivor. Both of them had various ranges of post-traumatic stress disorder. And my dad drank, so he was sort of sedated and absent to a large degree. He was not, in a traditional sense, a full-blown alcoholic, but he was, quite often inebriated to some degree. And so I learned to be super cautious around him, because not that he was aggressive or violent, far from it. He'd become sort of warm and cuddly, but it was like,
go away.
Go away. 14-year-old boys not necessarily wanting to sit on the couch with a cuddly dad. And so, and my mother was into this hypervigilance about politicians, and this was during the Cold War, so the whole potential nuclear thing was loomed very high on the agenda. What was different, though, is I got a very strong belief from my mum that I'm okay as a person. Mm-hmm. And that you're actually intelligent, but you don't apply yourself. so she was forever trying to crack the whip, and then in the end decided that was a futile effort, was just alienating us and, leave me to my own devices.
Right.
My ambition clicked into place when a lot of my mates were going to university and they were starting to sort of really, show signs of building towards a career, and I was still sort of thinking about how do I get out of working in the bank, which bored me to tears. Is there a possibility of making surfing a career? No, especially in those days. And so I actually ended up with a girl who was at university studying medicine, and I thought, maybe I could do something like that. Well, obviously not medicine. I'm, academically not strong enough. But when I got to university, I actually recognised, hang on a minute, I'm selling, like you, I'm selling myself short. And realised that actually my mum wasn't just trying to butter me up for her own glory in a way, and therefore resisted that. But that she was actually telling me the truth. Now, as an only child, I had things laid on. So for me, making an effort on anything, well, if it took too much, I'd sort of go, postpone that. So procrastination was a bit of an issue. But again, the thing I guess that I want to lead into is this idea about relationship and the impact that has actually on our own relationship to ourselves. And we need to overcome those sort of hurdles. Tell me, it is interesting thinking back on those days. Like when I was at uni, no one talked about neuroscience, right? The idea that psychology and neurology or the neurosciences somehow dovetailed was still really new. You had neuropsych, but that was all testing, which bored the crap out of me. It's like, why would I want to do this? 7-8 hours a day and then score this thing. Yeah. So I never related to that. So my desire was to actually work with people. How did you make that connection?
It was random, to be honest, to be completely honest. I enjoyed psychology because we had a neuropsychologist, actually, John Bradshaw, who's quite famous, he's written a lot of books and a lot of textbooks, and he worked with patients, so all his work was around Alzheimer's and
brain injuries,
Parkinson's and brain injury, and it was a fascinating work. And his lecture was basically him just talking about these unique patients that he'd seen, which was just fascinating me. So that's why I got into psychology. It wasn't really the soft side of it, if you like. I know it's not soft. They call it soft, but it's not soft at all. It's probably harder than the hard side of it. But it was for the neuropsych. It was that area that really fascinated me, and patient studies. And then I was doing neurophysiology because I was fascinated in our bodies and how we manage to do the things we do, like to survive, basically, the way we can survive. And I've always been fascinated with the water and swimming and all those sorts of things. So the exercise physiology really got me excited. But then in third year, we had to choose between 3 electives. And the hardest elective to get into was neuroscience. And they only took a certain number of people for neuroscience. And I got the marks to get into neuroscience. So I went, I might as well do it because I've got the marks to get into it. And so I did it. And just fell in love with that as well. Because we were in the medical faculty, we spent a lot of time doing stuff around, again, patient work and neuroscience and what was actually going on there. Because you've got to remember this was 30 years ago. I can't remember now. I won't say how old I am. But it was a long time ago. So there wasn't fMRI. There wasn't these new imaging techniques to actually look. So most of what we did was patient studies, when we were looking at neuroscience.
Observational stuff.
Your observational stuff. Yeah, or on corpses. So it was people after they died and then we cut up their brains. So I found that fascinating. But then I was really lucky because then I saw the start of fMRI, of the new neuroimaging techniques, which allowed us to look at humans while they were awake and without actually damaging their brains, which was fantastic. So I saw the start of that, and I was actually hired straight from my PhD to actually work on a project which was funded by Unilever in the UK, but it was here in Australia, to set up the first fMRI for humans here in Australia. So that's what I spent basically 2 years in the basement at St Vincent's Hospital with their scanner at nights, trying to get this thing to actually work the way it was supposed to work and the way it was being used overseas. So that was fascinating to be at the start of that, and to be at the beginning of cognitive neuroscience, because cognitive neuroscience is a really new discipline, and it came about because we got fMRI. Basically, we got this ability to look at wake humans. Before that, we didn't have it.
Yeah, no, that was completely non-existent when I was at university doing my undergrad stuff. And then again, I became. There's a point for me where I was doing a double major in philosophy, and the temptation was to actually ditch psych as a major and go into a major in philosophy. I had a mentor, and she was really keen for me to pursue, into an honours degree and PhD in philosophy, because I was blitzing that. It took no work at all, and, I was getting high distinctions in it. And, I got invited to a PhD discussion group, and I was like second year, student. Everyone looking down at you. There is a pecking order.
There is a pecking order. There's always a pecking order.
But my passion to actually work with people overrode the idea of sitting in the ivory tower, churning out all these books. And then I got a whiff of the politics at university as well, which sort of, it just didn't sit right with me. But I'm still very passionate about, psychology and philosophy. So I did courses in epistemology, philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, to understand how it is that we come to understand the stuff that you and I do. And I think that's invaluable. And I get a bit shirty with people who try to steer people away from engaging with philosophy courses, especially if you're doing, theoretical physics, which is 80% philosophising and the rest of it's mathematics and testing. So it's interesting to sort of get that, because one of the things that I want to lead to is, so what were some of the projects that really, sparked, where you've ended up, which we'll get to in a minute, which is about your book.
Yeah, so the biggest, well, not the biggest, but one of the things that really impacted me is I was asked, again, it was sort of random, but I was asked to be involved in what we call the LEAP program at Macquarie University. And the LEAP program, it's funded federally by the federal government, but each university can ask for money to try and inspire the next generation to actually go to university or to think about higher learning, whether it be university or to go to TAFE or whatever it happens to be. And I was asked to be involved in that. And what they asked me to do was to go out with them to remote areas and to talk to the kids at these remote areas about my experience, both growing up in remote area, but also then transitioning into university, and to also work with the students on neuroscience and what we now know about the brain, and that it changes constantly, and they can actually turn their brain into something really, really spectacular if they're willing to work on it. So I did that for a number of years, and we go. I still do it. I do it as a volunteer. 2 to 3 times a year we go out and we spend a week in a remote area, and we work with a whole bunch of schools. Now, a lot of these schools have a big gang problems, they have drug problems, they have huge truancy rates. A lot of them are lock schools, so they'll lock them in the morning. So 9 o'clock when the bell goes, they lock the school and the barbed wire around it, and then they don't open it again until 3 o'clock, and that's to keep the gangs out of the school, to stop the gangs from coming on the schools. So
not keep the kids in.
Not to keep the kids in, no. Yeah, people get that confused. No, the barbed wire goes on the outway so that it actually stops the gangs from climbing over the fences. And I love doing that because it does inspire some to actually go to university. And after a few years of doing that, I started meeting students at Macquarie University and at other universities or at conferences who had heard me talk and had been in that program and actually gone on to university, which is hugely inspiring for me. And so that made me want to work more with schools and with teachers, because I realised there was a real need for it. And the teachers were very positive about what I was saying and what I was teaching. So that then inspired me to do more work with schools and to do more research in that area, which has been fantastic. And I love doing it because, you can have a real impact, and teachers have a real impact. But I think teachers need to... One of the things I do a lot of work with teachers on is that kids don't learn until they connect to you. And so you've got to get the students to connect with you before any learning actually happens. And we know that from a lot of research and a lot of neuroimaging research now, showing that you've got to actually connect before you'll get that learning going on. And we all remember amazing teachers that we actually connected with, that we actually then did well in their subjects, and we still remember them and all that. And then we remember those teachers we didn't connect with, and we avoided them so that we wouldn't get in trouble. So that's sort of my trajectory. That's the main thing that really inspired me to do more work in this area and spend a lot more, which is why now I spend most of my time working with schools, which is fantastic. And I love doing that, and I love being in that area because it can have an impact, and I think we don't realise how much of an impact it has. We need to fund schools better, and we need to work on uplifting teachers into a status that they deserve, because it's such a big impact on all of us.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting because we have a similar problem in the area of medicine and nursing, where it's become so biologically reductionist that people forget the actual human being in it. And we know from masses of research that people physiologically heal better when they've got a really good connection with their doctor and the nursing staff. And having recently been in hospital with another shoulder replacement, I can vouch that my experience this time around was immensely different, because there were nurses there who were warm and engaging and responsive to what was going on for me, without necessarily sort of mollycoddling me or patronising me, but actually going, okay, this is what's going on, this is why you might be feeling this is how we're looking at addressing it, and this is what you can do for yourself. Now, being a psychologist and a therapist, I know that my own internal capacity to reduce the stress response is also going to help. But I think the important thing I think we're talking about is that the capacity to respond positively is fundamentally through the initial external relationship, and then how that translates internally and back again. I think there's a loop. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the great demonstrations of that is during COVID, at the start of COVID and the lockdowns, and everyone in hospitals had to wear masks. And there's a couple of hospitals in the UK where they found that the patients were struggling much more than they were prior to this, than they were in the mask. And they found that by putting a little window in the mask so you could actually see their facial expressions actually improved the outcomes for the patients again. And again, it's because then they could actually see what the doctors and what the nurses were thinking, because you get all that information from the face that they couldn't get before. And so, making that contact and making that connection through facial expressions, which is so important for us to make connections. But having that had a real impact on outcomes for all these patients. And then it flipped back again once they could make those connections again and actually have that relationship. So, completely agree. And there's dozens of other ways of looking at that which have shown that it's so important to have that connection.
Now, we're talking a lot about professionals and teachers, but I spend a lot of time, especially on the podcast too, trying to encourage parents to think in the similar terms. I mean, what I think is fantastic is now we actually have the neuroscience to back up the attachment theories that Bowlby and Ainsworth and so on. We're talking about as far back as the 1930s and 40s. And Alan Shaw is another guy who spent 2 days in a workshop, which was actually more like him sitting on the dais talking about his research. But it was immensely fascinating because he could draw the link between what we know theoretically and intuitively about attachment into demonstrating it through the science, the neuroscience of it, and how that influences. One of the things that ticks me, though, is that for some reason, all this work that people like, Alan Shaw and John Bradshaw have done seems to get, not as much traction as it should. And it's annoying because, if we're talking about making decisions based on scientific evidence, we're not really getting very far with this. I mean, teachers still aren't valued. They're often slotted into an information delivery, automaton, and I think we really need to start getting further ahead with that process.
Yeah, completely agree. Going back to your, the idea of parents and the connection, it starts as soon as the baby's born with touch, and that important touching of the baby with the mother, but also with the father. I remember I'll say fortunate, but it's probably not the best word to use. But when my first child was born, my wife had a cesarean because of complications. And so she had trouble getting out of bed. And so I actually looked after our daughter for most of that time, which was amazing. I had a sling that I used to wear, and so she was on me most of the time. And I have an amazing connection with my daughter because of that. And then I was again lucky, which is probably the wrong word, but when my son was born, because of the complications earlier, again, she had to have a cesarean. So again, I had him for the first 3-4 months basically on me most of the time, and have a great connection with him. But then my wife, unfortunately, I'll say unfortunately this time, broke her ankle as well after my son was about 6 months. And again, I had to take on that full-time carer role with both the kids. And it's a beautiful thing to have that relationship with your children. But having that connection with them and actually spending time with them and relating to them is so important as a parent, because you can't parent unless you have that relationship first. You need to have that relationship first, and it needs to be built with time, a lot of time, which is really, really important. But why do we have such nonsense in them out there, and why aren't we working? I think there's a small number of people who are making decisions in our country here in Australia, but also in the US, from my time in the US. They're the extremely wealthy people, and I think they have an agenda, and I think that's what the problem is. I think the media and governments are being played by these individuals, and I think we need to change that. I think we need governments to step up and actually start working for the majority of people, and stop. The media also need to actually do their homework. They don't
absolutely
do their homework.
I mean,
and that's really sad.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one aspect of it is the way science is reported, or results, that come out in science and how that's presented, and the selectivity around that, and the biases that occur within that, and how things are, some things are promoted over other things, and often it's, if it looks good economically, then we're going to push that more than, if it's a social issue. And I think we're basically missing out on that. So let me come down to, you've now worked on a book that you're about to get published, and the title is The Connected Species: How the Evolution of the Human Brain Explains and Offers Solutions to Societal Challenges, including racism, sexism, marginalisation and extremism. So let me ask you, give us, this is your opportunity on my podcast, to give us an overview about what brought you to writing the book, what you want to get across in the book, and let's take it from there.
Yeah. So what brought me? It's been a culmination of a lot of my research that I've done over many years. So a lot of my research has been in social neuroscience. So looking at how we communicate with each other, and the fact that our brains, the majority of our brains, have actually evolved to be social. We're social animals. So that's where most of my research has been, and then during COVID, I took voluntary redundancy because I wanted to work more, spend more time working with schools, and COVID was still going. And so I decided to sit down and write this book because it's something that I've wanted to do for a long time, but because of all my other things, it gave me the opportunity to do that. So that was fantastic. But yeah, I think it's really important that we realise that our brains have evolved to be social. We aren't the fastest or the fittest or the most aggressive animals out there. What brought us to where we are now is being social.
Yeah.
And our brains are social. And being social activates more of your brain than anything else we can do.
Yeah.
So if you actually want to keep your brain strong, because use it or lose it, if you don't use it, it is going to atrophy and you're going to end up with Alzheimer's and dementia and all these other awful diseases much earlier on. So we want to keep them strong. And we do that by using it. And the best way to use it is to sit down and have a chat with someone.
Yes.
So that's actually the best way to do it. There's lots of these apps that are available out there. They're all nonsense. They don't work. They're just using different parts of your brain, which you actually want to use your whole brain. And that's the best way to do that is to communicate, because it's really complicated.
Yeah.
And we've only had language for about 100,000. It's a bit controversial whether it's 70,000 or 160,000, but not very long. And most people, majority of people, actually haven't been able to read and write until the last 1 or 2 generations. So our brains actually haven't evolved to read and write, which is why it's so damn difficult for a lot of kids to actually learn how to read and write, because they don't have a brain that enables them to do that. So we need to realise that what we have evolved to do is to sit face to face and actually chat with people, because we get so much. We get so much information from that. We get so much information from the faces. We get so much information from touch. I mean, we have in our skin, in our hairy skin, which is the vast majority of our skin, we have C fibres, which activate a specific area of your brain, which is involved in connection, involved in actually opening you up and making you feel more connected with the other person, and releases these really important neurotransmitters, these chemicals in your brain, to make connections with people, which is why in all societies we have some way of touching each other. Even stoic societies like Australia and the US, we shake hands, and that's a way of touching each other, so we activate those C fibers. Even the Inuits in cold countries, the only part of their body that's showing is their nose, so they rub noses. So their skin's touching, so they get activation of this. I mean, it's quite fascinating when you actually think about it, that this neuroscience-based connection between the skin and the brain actually has manifested in all these behaviours that we have in all societies these days, to actually have that touch. So that's really important. So sitting down and chatting with someone is really important, and we need to realise that's the most important thing for us, is actually having these connections, actually spending time with people and having those relationships. And so that's what a lot of the book's about. But it also goes into how our face perception ability has actually evolved to result in what ends up being racism, right? That our face perception ability is based on this template, so that we can recognise thousands and thousands of faces, which we do, and over long periods of time, you have an average template in your brain, and then everything's worked out ratios based on that. I won't get into specifics, but it means that the faces that you see a lot are your basic template, and anything that deviates a long way from that is seen as abnormal or seen as different. And so this is why countries where you have very homogeneous groups, such as Japan, are the most racist countries in the world. Because of the fact that they only have certain faces that they see, and so therefore anything outside of that sets off their fight or flight response, is abnormal to their brain, and so therefore they react differently to it. So that's some of the concepts we go through, but then it talks more about how to get around that, but also how to get around some of the other issues in relation to technology, because of course that's dragging us away from each other.
I was just about to introduce that, because you know, like someone who's read your website tried to convince me that you're essentially a bit of a Luddite.
I love that. So I can program in 6 different languages. I'm a Siemens developer, actually, and one of the few external Siemens developers here in Australia. I love technology. I've been on think tanks for Canon and for Fujitsu. I've been funded by Canon. I love technology, and it's awesome. The problem is there's a couple of big multinational companies that are manipulating us via technology, and we need to realise that, and we need to stop that.
Yeah.
All the rest of it's awesome.
Yes.
But virtual reality is awesome. I've used and done some really good research in using virtual reality for both diagnosis and for treatment of eating disorders like bulimia and anorexia nervosa. So I'm not a Luddite. I'm quite the opposite of a Luddite, and I think people who are addicted to smartphones and are addicted to social media are the opposite. They're the Luddites, right? They're the people who don't realise that these things are actually impacting them and what's going on in the background. I understand the algorithms that are running in the background because I use them in fMRI. I was one of the first people to publish on the usefulness of using support vector machines, which are the algorithms in the background, for analysing fMRI data. So I understand the techniques that they're using and why they are so harmful to us. And that's why I'm concerned because, there are these big multinational companies that are making huge amounts of money out of our attention, and it is affecting us in extremely negative ways, and I think that's scary.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that it highlights for me, I mean, my response to this person was, you clearly don't know the man. So, would probably deem you to, get some understanding of who this guy really is, other than making a snap, biased opinion. But the other part of it is that, like with any technology, it's really important to consider the ethics in it. And, I'm an early adapter and adopter of technology. I mean, I started at university with punch cards. It was a painful experience, especially when I forgot to label with a pencil each individual card, and then I dropped the box.
Oh, no.
And I had to start again. That really strong learning curve out of that one. But then I came out of university, and my first computer was an Apple IIc. And so, I was busily learning how to find my way around that. And I've always worked on a machine, so I've both Apples, PCs. I started learning a programming language, but it bored me. It was like, and a friend of mine who is a programmer said, but it's just another language. You already speak two languages, half of a third one. What's the problem with programming? I go, it doesn't do it for me. It somehow there's this thing about I can invest my time elsewhere. If I want to get something programmed, I'll outsource it. Mm-hmm. It's that lazy thing that I've got as a kid, right? If you can avoid sweating it, outsource it.
Avoid it,
yeah. So again, I had the first iPhone. Mm-hmm. And within 3 months, I went, as good as this thing actually is, there is some serious pitfalls around it. And very early on, tried to warn parents especially about not giving the, small children, young children, access to this thing, but also being very cognizant about how much you're putting into it time-wise that could actually be put into your relationship with a child. And it's amazing how that often falls on deaf ears. They'll acknowledge it cognitively, but I reckon if we set up a behavioural observational study, the amount of time that they think they're on the device is completely underestimated to what they're actually doing. I always think back on the Max Planck Institute's research into contact over feeding times with children. And if you avert, the child becomes agitated and doesn't eat properly. There's a whole range of other stuff that goes along with it.
Yeah.
So, I know you're passionate about that, and, one of the things that you talk about is that smartphones make us dumber. Because one of my other concerns is that when I watch people in terms of just everyday knowledge and memory function, it's getting worse. And I know from personal experience, when I first got a smartphone, I put everyone's phone number in there, and I used to be able to hear a number twice, repeat it a third time, and it would stick, especially if I went priority number, like my wife's. And then within 3 or 4 months, I'd be scratching for the phone, trying to figure out, where do I find her phone number? So the other part that I find really interesting in this is the issue about racism, sexism, because this is where you and I start to overlap. And I was wondering what was it that sort of attracted you to the idea of you and I working on a book together about, which we're temporarily calling the man con, right?
Yeah, so just chatting with you about your work that you do with men really excited me because I grew up in a Catholic family and therefore very, I wouldn't say traditional, but yeah, it probably is very patriarchal sort of society. And because I grew up in a small country town, which was very patriarchal, very men do this and women do that. But since then, I've realised that they don't. It's not. There is a separation. And so having chats with you about what you were doing just made complete sense to me and fits really well with my research and what I've actually been doing for all these years. So, which is why, yeah, when you suggested that we think about doing a book together, it just seemed to make a lot of sense. And also, I think we have very complementary experiences in our professional lives. In that I've come from a very academic background, whereas you've come from actually working face to face with people, which means that we have. Very great synergy there. I think that works really well together.
Yeah, that was my sense too. And in psychology, we talk about training as a scientist practitioner, and that works on several levels. And there's some drawbacks in the way that it's actually taught that I have some issue with. But putting that aside, I'm always very conscious about if I'm going to espouse something in my work, is that based on opinion or is that actually based on fact? On verifiable evidence. And obviously in science, good science is not just about getting good answers, but it's in fact about getting better questions. And also, science being, falsifiable to some degree, so I can let the body of knowledge grow. And for some reason or another, especially at the moment, I'm getting a sense that attitude's actually shrinking into something that's more deterministic, less explorative, less expansive, more, isolated in some respects from other endeavours. I get this over-specialisation. Like I had a doctor say to a patient once, he's a haematologist, and she had leukemia, and he said she wanted to talk to him about how she was feeling in terms of the treatment process, and he held up his hands like this, and he went, "Madam, I'm not here to talk about how you feel. I'm only interested in your blood." Which takes us back to what we were talking about earlier on, which is, is that really what healing's about? Yes, you can be technically absolutely spot on. And in surgery in particular, I don't want to skip that over, right? But I also want someone who's going to engage with me and work with me to explain all of that. And I think that, we've socialised men into this solution-focused, technological way of looking at things often, which completely discredits or discounts the overall experiences. Like, one of the things that I see with couples a lot is that she says, "This is how I'm feeling," and he immediately launches in, "Well, I think you should do X, Y, Z," rather than just going, "Well, tell me a bit more about that." So the process in this is missing.
Yeah.
And listening to you about that whole notion about conversation and contact, that's the very thing that's going to bind us into leading an intimate relationship. And I think that, a lot of couples that I've seen is they actually don't understand intimacy. I mean, the blokes usually go for, "Oh, how much sex am I getting?" And she's going, "How emotionally absent in his vocabulary he is, he doesn't understand what I'm saying, doesn't empathise." And there's this big rift, and this is where I go, this is not hardwired into us.
No.
And, if we talk about, one of the talking points is that before we finish, because I'm noticing the time, is that there's all these myths too that are taken for granted, And you and I have talked about that notion. The name of the neuroscientist who coined it escapes me now, but neurotrash, for example. Well, I talk about psychotrash. That book, "Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus," drove me nuts. But I also see that amongst some of the neuroscientists. I mean, there's a number of neuroscientists who you go that we are just hardwired. female brain and there's a male brain.
Yeah, that's absolute nonsense. I mean, there's great research showing that there is no difference between a male brain and a female brain. They're exactly the same. There's been this big shift since we found the genome and we discovered that we have this genome which passed on from... There was this obsession with this idea that you have genes that are passed on to you and then that determines who you are as a person, which again is nonsense because the amount of information in your genome is very, very little information, and the vast majority of what happens is due to our experiences, not that genome, right? It's not pre-wired. It's not actually determined by that. It's determined by our experience. And I get a lot of people saying to me when I talk about this, but hang on, boys are doing this and girls do that. But that is determined by their experiences. We know that as soon as a child's born, well, even before a child's born, the mother will be treated differently as soon as they work out whether or not the baby's going to be a boy or a girl.
Yep.
And then there's the pink blanket, blue blanket experiments that they did where they just wrapped the baby in either a pink blanket or a blue blanket. And everybody who interacted with the child, from the medicos to the nurses to everybody, treated them differently whether or not they were wrapped in a pink blanket versus a blue blanket, which is crazy, right? Because there's no difference. We know that so emergency responder, someone who works as a paramedic, when they arrive at a scene, will treat the patient differently depending on whether it's a male or a female.
Yes, yeah.
Right? Everything we do is determined by whether or not we're male or female, which is nonsense because it doesn't make any difference. How someone is going to respond at an accident scene after having a car accident is going to be determined by what happened, not whether they're male or female. So, yeah, I think we need to realise that what we see as being masculine and feminine is determined by behaviour. It's determined by experiences, and how we treat each other, not by any predetermined genes in the body. And so we need to start treating both equally, and that starts all the way down before they're born. But I mean, some easy ones is the fact that we put girls in skirts and boys in shorts at school, and say boys line up here, girls line up there. Straight away tells them you're this way and you're this way. Girls don't. If girls are given the option to, or if girls and boys are both put in shorts rather than being put in skirts and shorts, the girls end up doing sports for much longer. The girls also are more likely to do science later on because of the fact that they're not being told you're petite, you shouldn't be doing exercise, you shouldn't be, because that's what we're telling them when we put them in skirts. I mean, there's so many, we can go on for hours and hours and I won't, but it's all based on our environment and how we set up that environment, and that's what's determining these strange associations between men and women and causing this crazy conflict that we're seeing.
And what I find really fascinating, and this is, when we talk about the resistance of attitude to change, is when I try to get that across often to, say, parents or people when I'm having like a talk at school, is that the resistance to those ideas comes out. But, a lot of people will go, but that's nonsense. Boys do, some things that girls just don't. And you look, but that's not genetic. That's, but I watched it in my baby when he was, 14 months old. And you go, well, by that stage, he's had a massive exposure to beliefs, attitudes, behaviours that essentially respond to this binary template that we're using. And so it's really hard. I suspect that if we had an evolutionary psychologist or evolutionary biologist with us, we'd have some very fiery debates, possibly.
Yes.
So I thought, okay, here's another myth. It's a jungle out there and the survival of the fittest. Right? Now, that one is at the heart of economic theory and application. What do you think?
Absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. I mean, if you just think about that, you've got a laptop in front of you which we're recording on. That laptop, thousands and thousands of people have all worked to get that laptop to you, right? Thousands of people, from the people who have dug up the minerals in the earth to actually create, and the people who have put the. That's just that particular laptop. But then if you also then think about all the people in the past who have done research and development and innovation and everything to get to the point where we've got laptops, right? There's hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the past that have all gone to... All of that is collaboration. We've got to the point where we are today through collaboration, through connection, through actually working with each other, not competition. As you know, I'm a huge fan of surf lifesaving, and I compete on... I don't compete anymore, but I patrol and so on. But I love watching the Ironman series where they all compete with each other, but they actually don't. If you watch, the ones who are in the lead, the one or two in the lead, they'll actually be competing with each other. Everyone behind them actually cooperate and work together to actually catch that lead bunch when they're behind. Because if they compete with each other, they'll knock each other back. They'll slow each other down by actually competing with each other. So they actually cooperate with each other to actually catch up to that one or two in the front. Cycling is the same. All of the sports where they're actually supposedly competing with each other, they don't. They actually cooperate with each other to allow themselves to actually move faster, to get there faster, to do better. And that's what we need to be doing as a society. That's what we all need to be working on. And sadly, when we compete, one or two succeed and everybody else fails. And I see that now. There's these billionaires out there who don't deserve to be billionaires, right? Because they're using everybody else's cooperation to be billionaires. Exploit. You look at Amazon, for example. I mean, I don't know whether I'm allowed to actually name things, but we know that Amazon, we have one or two billionaires that have come out of Amazon because they're at the top. But everybody else is getting paid pittance to actually do all the work. And they're the ones doing the work. They're the ones who should actually be supported. And we need to change that. Governments need to step up again. They need to be working for the majority of people, not for these billionaires, not for these people who are actually making huge amounts of money, but for everybody, so that everybody is actually supported, because it's the connection and it's that collaboration that actually has resulted in us being who we are.
As far as I'm concerned, this is about freedom of speech. You can say whatever it is you like. Powers to be, if they step in, I'll challenge them. I agree. Essentially what I see is not a capitalist system. I see a feudal system at work that has selectively taken some people through nepotism, legacy, and education, i.e., the private school system, and has allowed them to leverage. This whole idea of the self-made billionaire is rubbish. You don't become self-made in anything. The question is it through working with people that I've gotten somewhere, or because I've stepped on their bodies? And I think that's something that's really, and so this idea, that's being promoted, it has some of its origins in this, pseudo-Darwinian idea about the survival of the fittest, and competition is everything, and it selects those who are successful. It's just a nonsense. And the sooner we get a handle on this and begin to deconstruct those notions, the further along we're going to go in terms of managing racism, sexism, all the stuff that divides us. We're going to have more conversations about this, Mark, because again, I'm conscious of the time. So please let me thank you for coming onto the podcast. It's, as always, it's an absolute blast.
Thank you for having me. As always, it was a lot of fun chatting with you. As it always is.
And so, best of British for the launch of the book. We're going to have you on again when that happens.
Thank you.
And then, you and I are going to get our book done, and we'll have some more conversations about this. And I'm hoping to invite a few other people in as well, because we did that one with Mark Hodgson. And that was good fun as well.
It was very fun.
So again, thank you, and until the next time, this is Gunter signing off.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.